First thing that comes to mind when I hear the name Akhenaten, heretic.
Akhenaten was weird. He was a strange, odd guy who just simply was different from everybody else.
And of all the pharaohs in Egyptian history, he seems to create great divides. Even in eminent scholars who are otherwise well-balanced will either hate him with a really vehement passion or hold him up in this great light.
What sets Akhenaten apart is his sheer willingness to destroy the entire world around him to get everything he wants.
Akhenaten was the king of Egypt who came to the throne around 1350 BC, or maybe a few years before. But he's known because he was in many ways one of the strangest people who ever came out of ancient Egypt. He believed in a god that no one else had ever recognized as a god, the sun in the sky during the day that he called the Aten. He believed that the Aten was the light in the air and the creative force of sunlight. And so his theology was really a non-theology. It said to people, he created us, and when he dawns, you will live. And when the sun sets, you're just gonna lie there, unmoving, until it dawns again. It wasn't a well-developed theology, but it was, I think, what he personally experienced and wanted to be truthful about.
Bear in mind that the sun, Ra, had always been front and center in Egypt. All you have to do is go to Egypt and realize why that's the case. But Atenism was proclaiming one god above others, but it was a god that had been there for a very, very long time. It was the sun's disk. But the only way to worship the Aten was through Akhenaten.
So he was the only one who could interpret his god for the people. And that was a new vision, because the Egyptian king had been always the son of Re, the son of the sun god, since the 4th dynasty. But now, being the only son of the Aten, who was literally created, it says, out of the sun's rays, out of Aten's rays, it meant that only he could both interpret but also give any of that power that Aten had to anyone else. And he chose to give it only directly to his own family, to his wife Nefertiti and to his daughters. Everyone else had to get what they got from the Aten by way of praying to Akhenaten and his family.
Akhenaten worshipped the Aten. That was his main god. But he did not deny the existence of other gods. He just ignored them. So whether you want to call it monotheism or henotheism, doesn't really matter.
One of the things that people have a hard time understanding is that Egyptian religion was always more complicated than simply having a lot of gods. It was really closest to what we might call animism, in the sense that they believed that everything, the ground, the metals that they got out of the ground, everything had a spiritual capability. It had a divine force. And so all gods actually came from the same spiritual power. And for that reason, they could actually all be combined together in some ways. And Akhenaten's father, in many ways, believed that all the gods could be represented together as one, and that Akhenaten just flipped that on its side and decided that one god was really all that was needed to have all of that energy that was known throughout Egypt. the Egyptians had such a great system before Atenism because you could literally tailor a god to suit your personal situation. And you could call up that god in that situation if it was somebody who cures blindness or a particular kind of dysentery that you happen to have. Here, you have only one choice, and so it is quite literally putting all your eggs in one basket. And if Aten doesn't turn out to be fulfilling everything, then by means of Akhenaten, then you're out of luck.
So it's interesting, again, how Akhenaten is treated in terms of religion changes dramatically through the decades and centuries, and depending on who is writing. Sometimes he's touted as being a complete monotheist, which obviously he was not, because he includes other deities in his beautiful poetry that he may or may not have written.
Akhenaten's changes were absolutely shocking and revolutionary. And it wasn't because he just decided to worship the Aten. Nobody cares who he's worshiping. It's because it changed a lot of the world around him.
So when he came to the throne, his father had laid some of the groundwork. And in fact, there is some evidence building up now to suggest that there was even perhaps a temple to Aten being built on the west side of the Nile, even before Amenhotep III, his father, passed away. But it was Akhenaten himself and at least his followers who turned Aten into a true god. And that happened early in his reign, within the first 3 years. Well, in year 5, he starts to motivate people and find people who would like to move to the new city that he was founding in the middle of Egypt. It was to be the home for his god, and that he had looked and looked until he found a place that was absolutely virgin territory, that it belonged to no other god or goddess before this time. And that was important because that meant that no other god or goddess could make a claim on any of the people or any of what was produced there.
Because the city of Amarna has been so well excavated for decades now, we actually have a pretty good idea of what the different people who lived in the city of Amarna practiced and what they did in light of Akhenaten's religion.
The city was probably occupied for no more than 15 years at the most. And we think that it probably grew. I mean, no one has a good, perfect estimate. So the estimates are somewhere between 25 and 50,000 people, with as many as 3,000 houses that could have been accommodated during that time. They were definitely coming to Amarna to try and come up in the world, status-wise, money-wise, closeness to the king, closeness to power is always a drug for people. So over those 5 years, he had found new priests, he had found new elites to fill up his court. Now, he probably brought people from Memphis and elsewhere, but certainly it has to have largely been a cast of characters that he was grooming in his Theban location to take them up north. He suddenly made many people into actual wealthy, propertied people who could then enjoy that with their families. And I don't think it was hard for him to find followers. But when they did that, they left behind the rest of their family. So it was only nuclear families that we find that are accommodated in Amarna. And so there was pretty clearly an isolationism that happened for the people of Amarna.
Akhenaten did change the entire upper level of the administration to be his yes men. And a lot of these yes men chose to have the term Aten in their name. They chose to be buried at Amarna. And even if you look at their houses, basically on their front porch, they would have a little shrine to worshiping not the Aten, but to Akhenaten and the royal family, because in Atenism, only Akhenaten and the royal family could worship the Aten, and then everybody else had to worship him. One of these shrines would show how devoted you were, but it was a means of showing a political religious affiliation.
The whole belief that the ideology of the Aten was, front and center, of course, in Tel el-Amarna, but we have reason to believe through, various evidence that it wasn't practiced exclusively. And in fact, even at Amarna, in the workman's village, they had images of household gods, like the god Bes. So people were raised in a polytheistic religion. To throw that out the window completely probably wasn't done.
Some of the nobility followed along. Forget what I'm doing at home, it doesn't really matter, but I'm going to do this in public and stay on his good side because I want to be promoted and progress in my life in that way with work. And again, Amarna itself was a very small, isolated location in the middle of Egypt. In a lot of the rest of Egypt, some things continued the same. And I imagine, again, sort of the less elite, the less literate, the more things would just keep on going the way they always had.
Now, for ordinary people, who were farmers most of the time, maybe the people that they sold their grain to changed, maybe their taxation structure changed. There probably would have been some implications because the economy essentially collapses. But on the international stage, it is very shocking and revolutionary because all of these international kings and queens were talking to each other at the time. So the kings at this time would actually send each other international presents. They would send boatloads of gifts to each other. And Akhenaten becomes this unreliable, unstable partner who was not giving stuff away like his dad did. This changes all of international trade and politics.
Egypt, bear in mind, had moved its boundaries well into Syria and then to the south, well into Sudan or ancient Nubia. He just wasn't particularly interested. And the problem is that you have the rise of some very warlike, cultures, for example, like the Hittites and the Mitanni, and they're like bearing down on Egypt. They're just incurring all this wrath and skirmishes, just basically just nipping at the boundaries of Egypt's power.
Akhenaten ends up creating a massive amount of chaos in the entire country. By shutting down the temples of Amun, you send everything into economic collapse within the country. He even reappropriated the entire Egyptian army to, instead of defend the borders, they were running around the country like scratching out the name of Amun in all of these random places. He destroyed the wealth, the borders, the international connections of the country that they had been building for hundreds of years before this point.
Akhenaten was more concerned with his revolutionary religion. He just pretty much turned a blind eye to what was going on in the larger Egyptian world. In year 12, when there was a huge tribute ceremony where people from all the vassal states came in to give offerings to Akhenaten, the dramatic event that followed that tribute ceremony in year 12 of Akhenaten was likely a plague. Some of these foreign vassals brought in a pestilence, and it not only killed T, but it also killed 4 of Akhenaten's daughters. What we've been finding, particularly in the workman's village at Tel el-Amarna, is that it was, in fact, the Black Death.
He created his own theology, his own religion, and he built a whole new city. He moved his family and a large population to this new city. He created a new art style, and all of that in 17 years on the throne.
Akhenaten was the son of the Aten. So, of course, if he's a god, he's got to be unusual. The Amarna art style is radically different from what came before. The pharaoh before was always represented as a vigorous young man, even if he happened to be old. In the Amarna period, you just blow that apart. Essentially, the king is focusing on his uniqueness.
His approach to the art style was radical because the Egyptians had always had a practice of depicting the human body mathematically proportioned. Akhenaten came in and suddenly the proportioning of the body is completely different. Now you have a long neck, you have a very long, almost horse-like shaped face, you have a barrel-shaped abdomen, a tiny little waspy waist, huge swollen hips, and short stick-like legs. So the body looks nothing like the human body that had been represented in Egypt for many, many hundreds of years. We don't have any idea how he came up with this particular proportioning of the human body. Some people have suggested that he had a particular kind of eye problem, a retinal problem, that caused him to actually squint in such a way that he thought that that's the way people looked. We don't know, but we do know that the greatest artists from Amarna state in their on their monuments that the king himself taught them how to draw. So it was his art, and it was his choice.
Temple architecture also changes because before you had temples where the floor would ascend and the roof would descend, and that the most powerful area in the temple was the Holy of the Holies, where, of course, the statue was placed. And this statue was enlivened through various rituals, and every day, came to life. During the Amarna period, you have temples that are open to the sun. Essentially, they do away with small, dense, dark, Holy of the Holies place. Instead, it's open to the sun because what is the sun? It's the Aten. There is one of the Amarna letters talks about an emissary coming in from the northern lands or the Asiatic lands, and he's just complaining about the king makes us stand in the sun all the time, which of course, is in keeping with Akhenaten's religion, but in Amarna, in the summer, it is blindingly hot. One has to wonder about, heat exhaustion, simply because if you're waiting while the king is, conducting his ritual, that would be something that would be a little irksome.
Because Akhenaten was in many ways what we might think of as a scholar, or he certainly thought he was a scholar, and his whole reign he spent teaching people about this new religion. So he would write these long decrees and have them put on stone and written up. And in his new city, he had a whole series of these things placed around and sort of to make the boundaries of his new city.
And it really is about, when you read the Great Hymn to the Aten, it's about the rays of the Aten and how it wakes the world up, so that you have a lot of the art having to do with the natural beauty of the world, because this is what is reflected in the Aten's rays. Akhenaten died in his year 17. It looks like the year before his death, he might have reigned with a really ephemeral king or perhaps queen named Smenkhare. And when he dies, Tut is still a child. Enter Nefertiti. We're very sure that, in fact, Nefertiti ruled from 2 to 3 years, and she did this to kind of get everything together for Tut so that he could take the throne.
And we really don't know anything at all about his death or his passing, but we do know that that there is indications that there is another ruler already in waiting, as it were, who would continue. Akhenaten does seem to have had at least one, if not two, co-regents. There was a king Smenkhare. I think that he probably was a older brother of Tutankhamun, and that he reigned earlier in Akhenaten's reign and passed away young. And but then I think Akhenaten took a second co-regent, who was Nefer-Nefru-Aten, and that was actually Nefertiti, who became a ruler briefly until her own passing. And then we have Tutankhamun. Akhenaten built a huge tomb for himself. There are several other tombs in the royal wadi as well, but none of them really show us burials. And what we end up with is evidence that in the time of Tutankhamun, what burials had taken place were removed and transported back to the Valley of the Kings in Thebes. The name of Akhenaten was already considered to be anathema, something to be removed in the same way that he had removed the god Amen's name. His buildings, are still there. They were just torn down, but they didn't make the effort to always completely remove his name. Where you find it is on things like the Talatat, which are just small blocks from a temple. When it was on something large, then they had been attacked. So it's not all that difficult to re-find him, but standing monuments were not left. Like if you go to Amarna today and you see his boundary stele, they're still quite prominent. But of course, wherever his name was has got a big mark through it.
I think some of the biggest lingering questions of the Amarna period is about what happened outside of Amarna and Thebes. The majority of our evidence is from Amarna, and then we have a bunch of evidence from Thebes. But honestly, we don't know what happened in the rest of the country.
When Akhenaten dies, you have to understand that Atenism was a cult of personality. This is something that Akhenaten himself instituted. So it was clear without the personality, the cult would have a very, very hard time continuing. When Tut comes to the throne, he abandons Amarna, and we know that Amarna is abandoned pretty quickly.
After Akhenaten's downfall, a lot of people changed their names. So people name things like Mary Aten would change their name to Mary Ray or Mary Horus, and they would often take out the Aten in their name, in the same way that Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, or Ankhesenpa'aten changed her name to Ankhesenamun.
I suspect that for the more ordinary ancient Egyptians, the farmers out in a field somewhere out by Saqqara in Lower Egypt or further down south, I suspect that they just continued their merry little existence without having a clue as to what was going on in the political world. The people who mainly seemed to have really despised Akhenaten were those who had had their power taken away. They seemed to be the ones really intent on damning his memory and him during his life.
One of the enduring mysteries of the Amarna period is why? Why? Where did this idea come from? Some people think that it might have been that Akhenaten was greatly influenced by his father, Amenhotep III, who later in his reign deifies himself, becomes a god, and refers to himself as Egypt's dazzling sun.
A lot of times people suggest that Akhenaten wasn't quite sane, but when you look just at what he wrote and what he did, I don't think he was all that different, but he never sounded insane to me at all. He never sounded like he had lost his grasp on reality. He just had a different vision of reality. What happens with Akhenaten is he sort of takes it to the extreme. He was young. Kind of maybe took it a little far.
I personally think that he was very clever and not insane for most of his life. But I think that he did show signs perhaps, of having gone too far into the extreme towards the end of his life. His almost overreach may have dampened people's belief that kingship was there by divine order in order to keep divine order.
I think the change to Atenism was an extremely unique change in Egyptian history and in Egyptian religion, and there probably wasn't a more powerful shift religiously until the Romans essentially outlawed polytheistic religion.
We really have trouble understanding what the ultimate impact of Atenism was on Egypt. But I think that there is some indication for us that there was a negative impact. So it may not be Atenism that had the impact, but it may have been Akhenaten himself